My daughter, Grace, who had just turned 18, and I stood together, watching as my wife, Laura, and her boss, Dylan, loaded her suitcases into his car. Dylan, only 25, had shown up that Sunday morning, ready to drive Laura to the airport for a Monday meeting out in Los Angeles. They'd booked a flight that evening, needing to get there early for meetings ahead of some big negotiations. At 44, Laura still looked stunning after 25 years of marriage, standing confidently at 5 feet 7 inches with her dark brown hair and striking blue eyes. Though she'd added a bit of weight over the years, she kept that slim, curvy figure that always caught people's eye. We got married fresh out of high school, and I worked hard to put her through college, even squeezing in some online courses myself. Childbirth hadn't changed her much, and once she finished law school, we moved back to Alamance County to be close to family. By that point, we already had 2 kids, and Grace joined us during Laura's first year practicing law. As I looked at Dylan, a mix of emotions swirled in my stomach. I didn't like that cocky smirk he wore or the way he strutted around like he owned the place. I wanted to confront him right then and there, but I held myself back, knowing it would lead nowhere good. They were supposedly off to handle a civil case, but thanks to a tip from a woman named Samantha, I knew there was a lot more going on than just business. I was already in on their real plans. Laura and Dylan had brushed off our offer to drive them to the airport, choosing the comfort of his car instead. The fact that I had no clue when she'd be back only fueled my irritation. Physically, Dylan and I weren't much different. We were close in age, height, and build. But if a confrontation were coming, I was ready for it. Grace must have sensed my frustration building because she stepped in and wisely held me back from doing anything rash. We waved goodbye from the porch as Laura probably looked ahead to whatever excitement Los Angeles held for her. Laura's promotion to associate partner at the firm 2 years ago had turned our whole world upside down, and not in a way I would have liked. She let the power go to her head, though she hid it well from just about everyone but me. It was Samantha, Dylan's wife, who had reached out, spilling the truth about his pattern of affairs with women at the office. She'd told me she'd reached her breaking point and that her father was helping set a trap. Once Dylan's car finally disappeared down the road, Grace and I turned back into the house. "Does Mom have any idea that we're on to her?" Grace asked, breaking the silence. "That she's just another one on Dylan's list?" "Probably not," I replied. "Your mom's always had a blind spot for the truth, even with all her legal training. She doesn't give any weight to rumors and thinks she's got it all under control. For her, this is probably just an adventure, something to break the routine. She'll get a rude surprise when she finds out she's just another fling to him." Grace looked at me with a frown. "So if you knew all this, why didn't you stop her?" "You know your mom," I answered. "If I tried to warn her, she'd just dismiss it, call me jealous, and it would turn into a massive argument. She wouldn't change her mind, no matter what I said." "Does his wife know?" Grace asked. "Yeah, she knows. And so does her dad," I told her. "They're prepared to catch him in the act. This isn't his first time doing this, and Samantha's had her fill. Her kids are grown up, and she's ready to be done with it all." "Are you going to forgive Mom?" Grace asked, her worry evident in her eyes. "Not this time," I said, my tone firm. "I forgave her once before, but this is different. I've been thinking about divorce since the moment she left this morning." The shock in Grace's eyes was undeniable. Like her siblings, she'd had no clue about her mother's past. Finding out about this betrayal must have hit her hard. "Dad, you've got to explain," she urged. "I don't understand." "You're the youngest, Grace, so keep this just between us," I said quietly. "Before you were born, your mom cheated. Laura had kept the affair hidden until she found out she was pregnant. If a paternity test hadn't shown you were mine, Grace, I'd have walked away. Fortunately, the test confirmed that." Grace looked floored. Only 3 people in the family had known this, and we'd kept it under wraps all these years. "Who was it?" "Do we know him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been 18 years since I last spoke to him," I answered. "Your Uncle Adam. You and the others know him as Uncle Adam." Grace took a second to let it sink in. It suddenly clicked for her, why I'd always kept my distance at family gatherings with him, why her grandparents split holidays between us. Now, everything made sense. "You know, you could text Adam and mention Laura's little trip, that might stir things up a bit," I joked, trying to lighten the moment. Then I headed to the kitchen, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and picked up the local paper to skim through new listings, rentals, homes, anything. With Grace off to college soon, Laura could stay here until she graduated, but I needed to move out before she got back. Judge Anderson would likely prioritize the kids' needs in the divorce, so I had to think ahead and be ready. Grace's phone buzzed, and she stepped away to talk quietly for a few minutes. Later, she came back and said, "Uncle Adam admitted everything. He says he feels terrible for you and wants to talk." 18 years had passed, and I figured maybe it was finally time to hear his side. Laura's actions had dredged up the past, and though I'd stayed in the marriage for the kid's sake, now felt betrayed. I grabbed a bottle of bourbon and asked Grace to drive me to meet Adam. Our old meeting place, a secluded fishing hole on our father's land, was waiting for us. We sat by the fire, passing the bottle back and forth as Adam laid it all out. His version of things was different from Laura's, but I figured the real story lay somewhere in between. In the end, though, I'd stopped caring about the details. Hearing Adam take some responsibility was enough. I blamed Laura more than him. Adam had always been more of a follower. Eventually, our dad spotted the fire and, thinking we were trespassing kids, came up with his old rifle in hand. After realizing it was us, he ended up driving us back to the farmhouse in Adam's truck. Mom whipped up some eggs and potatoes to help us sober up, just like she did when we were younger. By the time we were done eating, Mom had already called Grace and Adam's wife, Mary, to let them know where we were. When they showed up, we were in much better shape. Mary, who'd married Adam after my parents' divorce, looked puzzled to see us together. "So, you two finally made peace?" she asked. "After all these years, we deserve to know what caused the split." I was about to explain, but Adam gave me a nudge, just like when we were kids. It was his signal for me to keep quiet. He'd always been the smooth talker between us, but this time, I was wrong. "It's about Laura and me," Adam confessed. "We had an affair while she was pregnant with Grace. It was my fault, I was immature and reckless back then." He admitted that our younger brother had caught them and, ever since, had seen him as good as dead. My dad let out a low whistle. "Well, hell, if I were Kevin, I'd have gotten rid of you right then." "What finally made you confess?" Mom asked. "Laura's in Los Angeles with her boss," I explained. "They only booked one hotel room, and it didn't sit right with me. Samantha, Dylan's wife, hired private investigators. Grace knows the whole story now, and it's been rough for her, watching her mom get so enthusiastic about this trip." Grace looked at me, her eyes full of conviction. "You should have let me confront him, Dad." There was a brief silence before I added, "Since Laura's staying in the house until Grace graduates, I'll need to find a new place before she comes back." "Dad, I'm not staying with Mom," Grace declared, her voice unwavering. "Wherever you go, I go. We're sticking together." Grace's determination mirrored my own. She wasn't backing down, no matter what lay ahead. "Come upstairs with me, Grace," my mom said, taking her aside. They were gone for a while, and when they came back, a new plan had taken shape. "We'll stay with my parents for now," Mom said, and we figured all we'd need were our clothes and a few essentials. During the drive home, Grace didn't hold back. "You've got to stop defending Mom," she told me. "We're adults now." She knew exactly what she was doing with Dylan in LA, thinking she could get away with it. That alone says a lot about what she thinks of us. Back home on Monday night, we gradually started packing up our things, each of us taking what mattered most, my old rocking chair, Grace's makeup table, and the TV, among other bits and pieces. Laura kept us updated throughout the week, though her progress seemed slow. Then, on Thursday, Samantha called and suggested we meet up at Jack's Roadhouse around 8 p.m. I arrived in my work clothes, just minus the tie, and recognized Samantha right away by the white scarf she had on. When I introduced myself, I was taken aback by how striking she was. She looked a good decade younger than me, with long blonde hair and gentle blue eyes. Her outfit was simple, even conservative, but she looked fantastic. She worked as a kindergarten teacher, which explained her understated style, while I, as an HR manager at a nursing home, usually dressed more formally. Samantha shared that Laura and Dylan would stay in Los Angeles through the weekend, with about 70% of their work on the case already wrapped up. She said they'd be served legal papers as soon as they got back. She asked how I was holding up, and I told her this time felt different. This time, we were talking openly about everything instead of burying it behind closed doors like we had in the past. I even mentioned that my older brother, Adam, had been tangled up in a similar mess 18 years ago, before Grace was born. We hadn't spoken since then, until last Sunday when Grace insisted we make amends. That reunion left me with the worst hangover I'd had in years. Samantha laughed as I added, what made it worse was Dad finding us at the fire like a couple of teenagers and hauling us back home. She chuckled, finding the story amusing, then added how nice it must have been to have family by my side. I told her that, for now, Grace and I were staying with my parents, only taking what we really needed. I also mentioned I'd keep Laura's number active until Sunday. After that, she'd be blocked for good. Before we parted ways, Samantha and I stopped by a nearby bar and danced for a while. In the middle of all the chaos, I felt genuinely good. That is, until I got home, and Grace started teasing me, joking, Daddy's got himself a new girlfriend. She'd picked up on the sparks between Samantha and me instantly. Sunday dinner was something special. My mom couldn't have been happier cooking for us again, and we cleared nearly every dish on the table, leaving barely any leftovers. But around 1 a.m., a phone call woke me up. It was Samantha, letting me know Laura and Dylan had been caught red-handed. Hotel detectives had walked in on them, capturing everything on hidden cameras. She even sent me a temporary copy of the video. I got up, dressed quietly, and headed downstairs to make some tea. Just as I finished, my mom joined me. "Is the water still hot?" she asked, and I poured her a cup, then showed her the video on my phone. Her expression shifted as she watched. The footage was crystal clear. There were Laura and Dylan, tangled up under the sheets, looking as guilty as sin. Their shocked reactions made it plain that they hadn't been in LA for just business. Mom quickly saved a copy of the video to her phone, and with a resolute tone, she said, "We're done with Laura. I can't wait to see the look on her face when she's served with that lawsuit." Grace and I already blocked her number, I told Mom that night, reminding her we'd prepared for this step. Later, my mom took Laura's phone, and I helped her block every line of communication. Sharing that late-night tea with my mom brought back some warm memories. The next morning, I instructed the receptionist at work to block any calls from Laura. I had no intention of speaking with her. By 11 a.m., the receptionist called me, sounding a bit frazzled. "She's been trying to reach you every 20 minutes. What should we do? What's your cell number?" I asked. She gave it to me, and I replied, "I'm sending you a video clip. If she calls again, ask for her cell number. Once you have it, send her the video and tell her both Grace and I watched it last night." That was the last I heard from Laura for the day. Before I left work, the receptionist confirmed she'd done as instructed. She stopped calling after getting the video, she added, offering her help if Grace or I needed anything. I thanked her quietly and kept my thoughts to myself as I headed home, where Mom was preparing dinner, and Grace was helping out in the kitchen. As I updated Grace about a work incident, a text from an unfamiliar number popped up, claiming to be from my mom, asking me to call back. It didn't take long to figure it was probably Dylan's number. "I think your brothers might reach out around 8 tonight," I mentioned to Grace. "Your mom will likely contact them when she realizes we're gone. They'll be in for a surprise," Grace chuckled. I told Grace I'd left a note for Mom, suggesting she might want to consider kicking Dylan out, considering his own wife had already done so. "It's funny," I added, "because Laura will never admit the truth to our brothers." "Hey, Dad," Grace said with a grin, "let's turn off our phones for a bit. That way, they'll have to call Grandma if they want answers." And that's exactly what we did, enjoying a rare, peaceful evening for ourselves, even if it wasn't as calm for everyone else. Later, we found out my sons had stopped by the old house. Noticing my favorite chair was gone, they searched the entire place. When they found Grace's note in the kitchen, it was clear we'd moved out. All their calls went unanswered, only adding to their confusion. Laura played dumb, pretending she didn't understand the note or have any clue where we'd gone. Eventually, they turned to Adam, who hinted that maybe I didn't want to be found, considering what their mom had done. Strangely, they never thought to ask how Adam even knew about it. Word of our breakup spread like wildfire. At work, my eldest son, Ethan, called me after my secretary connected us. He cut straight to the point. "So, Dad, where are you and Grace living now?" "Not much to say," I replied. "Everything that was wrong is now right and vice versa." "Come on, Dad, let's skip the philosophy. Just tell me what's going on." "Check your texts," I told him. "I sent you something that'll answer your questions. Forward it to Jacob, too. If you want to talk, meet me at Grandpa's after dinner." With that, I ended the call, sent Ethan the video of Laura and Dylan's affair, and let Grace know what I'd done. Within 10 minutes, Ethan replied with a single word, "Wow." He followed up, saying he'd be at Grandpa's by 8. When Ethan and Jacob arrived, my parents quietly excused themselves, giving us space to talk. My sons didn't seem to grasp the weight of the situation. They shrugged off their mother's actions, telling me to let it go. "Everyone makes mistakes, Dad. Remember how many times you forgave us when we were growing up." Grace didn't take kindly to their attitude. "You may be my brothers," she snapped, "but you're both idiots if you think this was just a mistake. Mom and Dylan planned everything. The hotel was booked under Mr. and Mrs. Dylan Ward a full week before they even left." The look on my sons' faces as Grace laid out the details is one I'll never forget. "We watched Mom leave the house that Sunday afternoon, knowing full well what she was off to do," Grace continued, her voice firm. "Dad even offered to drive her to the airport, but no, she wanted the satisfaction of showing off by leaving with him. I bet we were the punchline of their jokes all the way to LA. She didn't have a clue that we were onto her." Grace turned to me. "Why didn't you stop her, Dad?" I explained patiently, if I had tried, she would have lied straight to my face, denied everything. "Your mom's actions already showed she was mentally checked out of this marriage. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, planned. Dad and I knew what was going on 2 weeks before she left," Grace added. "Dylan's wife, Samantha, was the one who warned us. That's why we had video footage ready within an hour of serving them with the lawsuits. Boys, you need to understand, Mom didn't just betray Dad. She betrayed every one of us." I looked at my children, knowing it was time to be completely transparent. "I'm seeing a doctor tomorrow to get tested for STDs, I admitted. Their shocked faces said it all. "I can't be sure she didn't have other lovers along the way. This may just be the first time she's been caught, but all those frequent business trips, they make you wonder." "Dad, you can't be serious," Jacob protested. "There's no way Mom was with other guys." "Given everything we've learned," I replied, "can we honestly believe she'd tell us the truth?" I left them to let it all sink in, excusing myself to pour a coffee. My parents, who had been listening quietly nearby, nodded in agreement. "You're handling this wisely, Kevin," my father said. "Considering her job and all those business trips, it wouldn't be surprising if she'd taken more opportunities than we know. Between the mediations and those business conferences, she could have hidden just about anything," I added, thinking back. "Even if she had a separate phone, those calls would have gone under the radar." Just then, my phone buzzed. I stepped out onto the veranda to answer it. "Hi, Samantha. What's going on?" She took a deep breath. "I spoke to Dylan recently, and it didn't go well. He still can't see why I'm divorcing him. He thinks I should just forgive and forget, but I made it crystal clear, he's not welcome in our daughter's life anymore." That's when it hit him just how much damage he's done. "Oh, and Laura's having a hard time now, especially since she's unemployed. They'll be back on Thursday to settle everything. I've already blocked Laura's number, and the receptionist knows to turn down her calls. I even sent her the video you shared, so she's aware we're all in on this," Samantha added. "Dylan's things are packed in the garage until he comes to pick them up, and I've changed the locks." We exchanged a few more words before saying goodnight. I returned to the kitchen, where my family was waiting expectantly for the next step. "I'm taking tomorrow off," I announced. "I've got a lawyer appointment at 9. I want those two served with lawsuits as soon as they land back home." Tears welled up in my son's eyes as the weight of it all began to sink in. My father stepped in, his voice steady. "Dylan may not be the first, but he'll damn well be the last." "That's not true," Jacob protested. "Mom denied everything until we showed her the video." My mom stepped in, shaking her head. "Jacob, have you ever wondered why your father never spoke to Uncle Adam until now? They only reconciled last Sunday." Grace added, "Adam admitted Dad didn't deserve what happened back then, but it happened all the same." Tensions were high as we confronted pieces of the family's past that had been hidden for years. I turned on the kettle, giving my kids time to process everything. Later, after my sons had gone, I sat down with my parents for a quiet heart-to-heart. "They'll be watching how you handle this," my mom said gently. "What you do now will set the tone for them." "I know, Mom," I replied. "I'll keep my calm and let the lawyers do their job. I can't undo what's been done, but I can control my response from here on." The next day at the lawyer's office, I laid out everything that had brought us to this point. Her interest piqued when I mentioned Laura's employer. "Did you know I once worked at that firm?" my lawyer asked as we discussed strategy. "They have an extremely strict code of ethics. We could consider suing the firm, too, though it might just cover the legal fees. Still, it would stir up a lot of trouble for them." I agreed to move forward, knowing Laura and Dylan would be back from LA on the earliest Thursday flight out of St. Louis. After settling her retainer, I could tell my lawyer was fully invested, eager to take on the case. I felt a bit like David going up against Goliath. Laura's company was the largest firm in the area, with several divisions under its wing. Later that day, at the doctor's office, my family physician looked surprised when I requested a full panel of STI tests. Though the request was unexpected, he agreed it was a wise move. Meanwhile, I learned that Ethan had told Laura about my tests, not holding back as he shared that, thanks to Adam and Dylan, I couldn't be certain how far her betrayals had gone. That evening, Samantha and I met for dinner at Red Lobster. She welcomed me with a warm smile, and as we sat down, she handed me an envelope. Inside were statements from 5 of Dylan's former subordinates, describing how he pressured them into inappropriate situations. "This will make our case even stronger," I noted. Originally, my lawyer had thought we'd only be able to cover her fees, but now we had the potential to expose a deeper culture of misconduct. Samantha and I connected over our shared experiences, and on my drive home close to midnight, I reflected on how much had shifted since Laura had left. Later that night, I made tea for Grace, noticing tears welling in her eyes. I handed her a cup and softly said, "It's okay to let it out, Grace. Crying is part of healing. She hugged me tightly, finally allowing her emotions to surface. By the time we'd finished our tea, she'd calmed down. Curious about my dinner with Samantha, Grace asked a few questions. I explained that we were just getting to know each other and that it felt like the beginning of a solid friendship. The next morning, I dropped off the statements with my lawyer, who then suggested turning this into a class action lawsuit. I agreed, hopeful it would bring accountability to a lot more people than just Laura and Dylan. Later, I heard that Laura and Dylan's return was anything but smooth. Despite the settlement, their actions had made local headlines, casting a shadow over any sense of relief they might have felt. On my way home, I withdrew $1,000 and handed it to my mom. She gave me a look only a mother could give. It's to help with the extra expenses while Grace and I are staying here, I explained. It would have cost me way more anywhere else. She crossed her arms with a wry smile. This is a one-time thing, agreed. I nodded, grateful for her support. Meanwhile, Laura returned to an empty house, feeling like she no longer belonged. The day had been full of resentment, and both she and Dylan had become persona non grata. Now, her husband and his attorney were suing the entire firm, and she couldn't wrap her mind around how Kevin had found a former employee to represent him, someone who would never have made partner otherwise but was familiar with all the firm's legal maneuvers. The realization hit hard. Kevin had hired someone who knew exactly how to put the firm on the defensive from the start. After mixing herself a stiff rye cocktail, Laura sat down and began reading through the divorce petition. Reality sank in as she realized that Kevin and Grace had known about her and Dylan's plans before they'd even left for LA. Now, she was facing the fallout of her marriage ending. Feeling regretful, she texted both Kevin and Grace, coming to terms with the fact that the damage was beyond repair. She hoped to buy herself some time, thinking that if Kevin had a chance to calm down, maybe they'd be able to talk. But Ethan's words echoed in her mind, her actions now seemed blatantly deceitful to everyone. The pain she was causing no longer felt worth it. As she sorted through the day's mail, she came across a letter from the county health department. It confirmed her worst fear. She had contracted an STD. Crumbling under the weight of it all, Laura broke down in tears, realizing that the nightmare she was living was only intensifying. Her past encounters during business trips would now weigh even heavier on her family's view of her. Meanwhile, Dylan was slumped over at a dimly lit bar on the edge of town, drowning his regrets. Samantha had filed for divorce, and as he stared blankly at his drink, he barely noticed when a man slipped quietly onto the stool beside him. Suddenly, a scuffle broke out, and in the chaos, Dylan took 3 hard hits to the face. His attacker's words carried the weight of my own resentment, making it crystal clear why he was being punished. Back at my father's barn, I was working on some chores one Saturday afternoon when Ethan, my oldest son, showed up. His determination was clear. After comforting his heartbroken mother, he was set on persuading me to take her back for the sake of family peace, despite the upheaval she'd caused. I let him speak his piece, knowing there was no point in arguing until he'd gotten it all out. "Ethan, imagine you're married," I said finally, "and you found out your wife had been unfaithful. Would you still be giving me the same advice?" His silence said it all. I continued, "You're asking me to stay with someone who betrayed me. Does that mean you think I don't matter? That I'm just here to be walked all over?" The shock on his face was undeniable. Sensing his distress, I added firmly, "If you can't respect my decisions, then don't come back." I walked away, knowing he'd need time to process. Later, Ethan went to his uncle Adam for guidance. Adam didn't hold back. "Ethan, your mother came after me, not the other way around. I fell for her, and that led to 18 years of separation from your father. There are always 2 sides to every story, and your dad is right. Your mother didn't catch that STD from Dylan, she brought it home, showing she didn't care about your dad after all he's done for this family. Fix things with him before you lose him for good." By Monday morning, at the firm where Laura and Dylan worked, they were back in the limelight. With my lawsuit dropped, their reputations had bounced back, and they were showered with praise for their successful case settlements. Despite his bruised face from the bar fight, Dylan pushed on, privately sharing the whole ordeal with Laura. That afternoon, as I was leaving the nursing home where I worked, I saw Laura waiting by my car. She looked exhausted and defeated. "Back off," she snapped. "Dylan's got enough problems, thanks to your little revenge scheme." "I have no idea what you're talking about," I replied, staying calm. "He got jumped," she insisted. "The guy said he was your friend and that we keep doing it." I couldn't help but laugh. When I composed myself, I said, "If I knew who did it, I'd buy them a bottle of whiskey. Your lover got off easy. If it were me, he'd be dead." Just then, I got an urgent text from Samantha, asking me to come over immediately. I looked at Laura one last time. "Get yourself a lawyer and finalize the divorce." Without waiting for her response, I drove off, done with her games and lies. When I arrived at Samantha's place, I could see the worry in her face. "What's wrong?" I asked. "One of your dad's friends punched Dylan, claiming he did it in your name," she explained. I couldn't hide my grin, which seemed to bring her a bit of relief. "Aren't you mad?" she asked, looking up at me. "Nope," I replied with a chuckle. "I just wish I knew where he lived so I could send him a bottle of whiskey." Samantha laughed, and I pulled her into a brief hug. Before I could say a word, she surprised me with a quick kiss on the cheek. "They're both inside, waiting to talk to you," she said, leading me into the kitchen, her hand still holding mine. Her two young daughters, Sophia and Olivia, peeked out from their room as we walked by, and I gave them a playful wink. They giggled, winking back with matching grins. Samantha's father, a tall, imposing man with a warm smile, greeted me as I walked in. I extended my hand with a grin, saying, "If I could, I'd send you a big bottle of whiskey as a thank you." He shook my hand firmly and replied with a chuckle, "Just think before doing anything reckless. My old man's advice saved me a lot of trouble when I was your age." With the tension broken, we moved into formal introductions, and soon enough, it was time for him to take his grandson home. That left me with Samantha and her two daughters. The girls, bubbling with excitement, introduced themselves and told me all about their favorite restaurant, an all-you-can-eat pizza place called Papa Dino's. I knelt down to their height and asked, "How about I treat you and your mom to dinner there tonight?" They agreed enthusiastically, probably swayed by my casual clothes. "Just give me a second to call my mom and let her know I won't be home for dinner," I said with a smile. At the restaurant, a few of Samantha's colleagues waved at her while she was getting more pizza, and Sophia seized the opportunity to ask, "Are you mom's boyfriend?" I smiled and replied, "I'm just a guy, a friend." "Did you go on a date?" she asked, not ready to let it go. "Not yet," I teased, "but I'd need permission from someone special first." "Who?" Olivia asked, eyes wide with curiosity. "From you and your sister," I answered, which made them giggle. "You can," they said together, laughing, "because Mom already says she likes you." When Samantha returned with more food, we were all in high spirits. Olivia asked if I'd get her dessert, and after we wrapped up at the restaurant, I thanked them at their front door. The girls hurried inside, ready to get ready for bed. Feeling a bit awkward, I was about to say goodnight when Samantha stopped me on the steps. She leaned in, and before I knew it, she kissed me, and I couldn't help but respond. "My daughter said you were going to ask me out," Samantha revealed with a grin. "Well, Sophia got it a bit wrong," I replied with a laugh, "but I did think about it while you were busy talking to your colleague." We ended up sitting on the porch like teenagers, talking about our feelings and what might come next. With September winding down, we planned to take the girls to the town fair the following Saturday and decide from there what our next step might be. It was close to 10 p.m. by the time I returned to my parents' farm. The moment I walked in, Grace noticed my upbeat mood. "Looks like Dad's got a big grin on his face," she observed. "That meeting must have gone well." I filled my parents and Grace in on the day's events. My dad found it especially amusing that Laura had the nerve to ask me to back off from Dylan. On Friday, my lawyer had filed a fresh lawsuit against the firm. 4 senior partners and 16 women were named in the suit, which was hand-delivered to the partners' homes. 3 of them ended up being barred from returning to their homes by their own spouses. Linda O'Neill, my attorney, was relentless, even tracking down the name of Laura's divorce lawyer. My mom went a step further, emailing Laura's relatives and informing them of how Laura and Dylan were served. She didn't hold back, mentioning that this wasn't Laura's first affair during her business trips and revealing my STD diagnosis. As I was getting ready to pick up Samantha and her girls for the fair, Grace commented, "You're really into Samantha, aren't you, Dad?" I admitted, ever since the divorce started, most of the friends your mom and I shared have disappeared. Samantha and I have bonded over what we've both been through, and it makes it easier to trust her. I'm not sure where this will lead, but I'm open to seeing what happens. If you need any dating tips, just ask, Grace teased. Just promise to introduce us before it gets serious. At the fair, I spent a good hour on the Ferris wheel with Samantha's daughters, who couldn't get enough of it. We indulged in all the fair food, with Olivia perched on my shoulders most of the time. Later, we ran into Adam and his wife, Mary, who introduced their own kids. The kids immediately got along, leaving us adults some time to chat. By 6 p.m. Samantha's daughters were worn out from the day's excitement. After we bathed them and tucked them into bed, Samantha got a call from Dylan. He was back in the ER after getting punched again. Samantha assured him it wasn't me, reminding him I'd spent the entire day at the fair with her and the girls. Dylan didn't seem convinced, but there wasn't much else to say. I left Samantha's house around 9 p.m., feeling that things between us were gradually moving towards something more. On Sunday afternoon, I picked up Samantha and her daughters, and we headed to Adam's place. My entire family was there, including Grace, who'd brought her date along. It was a significant moment for Adam, having me in his home for the first time since he got married. Mary welcomed Samantha and the girls warmly, and they fit right in. Things took a turn when Ethan pulled me aside. "Dad, I messed up," he admitted, sounding remorseful. "I fell for Mom's manipulation. She tricked me. Uncle Adam and my coworkers filled me in last week. What did you learn from this?" I asked, wanting to see how he processed it. Ethan thought for a moment. "When it comes to family, sometimes it's best to step back. No matter what you do, you might just make things worse. People need to work through things in their own time, not on anyone else's schedule." "You're right," I replied. "But it's hard to keep that distance when we care so much. Your mom and I will talk someday, but given her behavior lately, it won't be anytime soon." Ethan nodded in agreement. "Yeah, her actions pretty much speak for themselves." "They do. Look at Samantha," I continued. "She lived in a loveless marriage but waited until she was ready to raise her girls alone. She showed patience and integrity. Your mom, on the other hand, has shown us a different side, one that shocked Grace and me with its cruelty. She says one thing, but her actions paint a different story. As Grandpa used to say," I added, "if I'm not worth the truth, then you're not worth lying to." Ethan looked down, then asked a hard question. "What else did she lie about, Dad?" "That's something we may never fully know," I answered. "There's no use dwelling on the past. All we can do is learn from it and keep moving forward." "I really respect Samantha, Dad," Ethan admitted, "but the more I hear about Mom and Dylan, the more it sounds like they're perfect for each other." Just then, Grace came over, noticing the attention our conversation was drawing. "Maybe we can finish this later," she suggested, sensing the tension. "We're done, sis," Ethan assured her. "I just needed to apologize to Dad." He walked off, leaving Grace looking curious. "Just a matter of saying the wrong thing," I explained to her. "But I'm glad he owned up to it." Meanwhile, Adam and Mary were enjoying dinner with the family, and Mary took several photos, especially as Olivia kept close to me. When the inevitable water fight broke out, I joined in without hesitation, even though it ended with me completely drenched, lounging in a chair to dry off. Olivia climbed onto my lap, and soon enough, she drifted off to sleep. I glanced over to see Mary and Samantha chatting, likely about the growing bond between me and her girls. My dad joined me as I relaxed. "This little one seems to have chosen you," he remarked, glancing at Olivia curled up in my lap. "Just be sure revenge isn't what's guiding you." I chuckled and shared the story of my connection with Samantha, starting from her first phone call. He listened thoughtfully, nodding. "I should have trusted my instincts back then," he said, then added, "Your mother asked me to talk to you. Whatever you decide to do, know that we're here to support you." "Dad, just look at the world today," I said, shifting topics as we sat together. "We have a Democrat in office, someone who actually echoes the values JFK stood for, yet conservative members of Congress are resigning left and right. The GOP is now upholding Kennedy's principles, but the media brands him a traitor. They're pushing for his impeachment, even though he's remained consistent. Meanwhile, they're backing a candidate guilty of the same things they accuse him of. What kind of message does that send? It's the same disregard for truth and morality I'm seeing in my soon-to-be ex-wife," I continued. "For people like that, values only seem to matter when someone's behind bars. That's when they fake remorse." My dad chuckled. "People should flush about 100% of the media's truths right down the toilet. Real honesty is hard to come by these days, but most folks are too blind to see it. It's ironic to see two factions of Democrats tearing into each other, isn't it? And despite all the attacks, I have to wonder if their problem with him is just that he's too competent." "Strong words, Kevin," my dad said, nodding in agreement. "But it really shows just how powerful the media is as a tool for propaganda." The following Monday, a detective stopped by my office to discuss the ongoing trouble with Dylan. We spent about an hour going over everything I knew, and I gave him a list of women whose husbands had discovered Dylan's affairs. "Officer," I said, "you should definitely speak with Linda O'Neill. She has a lot more insight on this. I've known about their relationship for over 6 weeks now, thanks to Dylan's wife, Samantha, who tipped me off." The detective nodded, jotting down notes. "Dylan seems to blame you for his marriage falling apart," he observed. "Sounds like he's one of those guys who just can't take responsibility." After the detective left, I called Linda to give her a heads up. She had expected something like this from Dylan. He was always setting people up, and she was convinced he was the reason she'd been forced out of the firm. Later that evening, back at my parents' house, I learned that it was actually my mother's letter that finally made Laura accept that things were over. Up until that point, Laura still thought she had a shot at working things out. On Wednesday, Grace and I took Samantha and her daughters to dinner at the pasta house, and my sons joined us. During the meal, I shared the news that Laura had finally hired a lawyer to move the divorce forward. Samantha's daughters adored having Grace around, and the dinner was a success overall. 2 months passed since our last family meeting, and on a Friday afternoon, I sat beside Linda O'Neill in court, waiting to be called before Judge Robin McCullough. Across the room sat Laura and her lawyer from the firm. We'd already agreed on how to divide our property, and since there was no mortgage, the process was pretty straightforward. Laura would buy out my share of the house and split our joint savings with me. When the judge called us up, we confirmed our agreement, finalizing the divorce. As I was leaving, Laura stopped me on the courthouse steps. "I ruined myself," she admitted quietly. "I finally came clean to the boys. Grace still won't speak to me. She thinks I did all of this on purpose." I sighed, understanding Grace's reaction. I can accept her thinking that, given her inexperience. But from an adult, it just sounds shallow. Samantha's divorce had wrapped up before ours, and she'd managed to get a fair settlement from Dylan. He was ordered to pay $1,000 a month in child support, $500 for each child until they turned 18, and to cover half of their college expenses. Their house would be sold, with the profits split evenly. Dylan had left the firm and moved to a new city, probably sick of running into angry faces. With his share of the firm, he was financially set. One evening, my parents invited Samantha and her girls over for dinner. To our surprise, they'd also invited her parents. With our relationship becoming more serious, my parents thought it was high time to get to know Samantha's family better. Meanwhile, Linda O'Neill had worked out a settlement with the firm's insurance company, and it looked like the case would be handled out of court. After Linda took her 30% fee, each of us would be left with over $750,000. That night, as we gathered around the formal dining table, which hadn't seen use in years, I felt the moment was right. I stood up, pushed back my chair, and, taking a deep breath, got down on one knee. Pulling out a small box, I asked, "Samantha, will you take a second chance at happiness and marry me?" Samantha, completely taken by surprise, managed to stammer, "Yes." And that's when the real celebration began. Mom quickly called Adam, Mary, and my sons to share the news, and they arrived within half an hour, filling the house with even more excitement. In the midst of the congratulations and chatter, I noticed little Olivia sitting off to the side, tears in her eyes. I walked over and gently sat beside her. She immediately climbed into my lap. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I asked softly. "Nothing," she whispered. "I'm just happy, because you're going to be my dad." I glanced over at Samantha, who also had tears in her eyes, and I knew she saw them in mine too. Holding Olivia close, I walked over to Samantha, and everyone fell silent, recognizing the importance of the moment. Sophia came over and stood by us. "Dad," she asked in a soft voice. "When you and Mom get married, can we take your last name too?" "As soon as the court allows," I promised. Sophia and Olivia looked over at my father, who smiled warmly. "From now on," he said, "you can call us Grandma and Grandpa." I could already picture my daughters spending time on the farm, learning to ride horses with my dad. They were going to love it. Later, in a quiet moment, Samantha pulled me aside. "How are you going to convince Dylan to let you adopt the girls and change their last name?" she asked. "Leave that to me," I replied with a smile. A month later, I walked into Dylan's office unannounced. His secretary waved me in, and as I closed the door behind me, I could see that his face, though mostly healed, still bore marks from the beating he'd taken. He'd been punched 8 times, and while detectives had questioned all his former lovers and their husbands, they hadn't pinned down any suspects. "I think you've heard that Samantha and I are getting married," I said, watching as his expression turned pale. It was clear he suspected I had a hand in his injuries. "What do you want?" he asked nervously. "I need your permission to legally adopt your daughters so they can take my last name." Sophia asked her mother and me if she and Olivia could become part of my family in every way that matters. "Legally, I want this to recognize us both as their fathers." "Why should I agree to this?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "Because if you do, I'll stay out of your life for good," I replied calmly. "If you don't, well, we might end up crossing paths a lot more often." It took him half an hour to draft the document and sign it. His secretary, who was also a notary, stamped it on the spot. I knew he didn't care much for the girls, he hadn't seen them since he left for Los Angeles. Later that day, I stopped by the school where Samantha taught. Since the staff didn't know me yet, I had to go to the office. When they called her class, Samantha came out, clearly surprised to see me. "Samantha," I began, handing her an envelope, "I made a promise to your daughters the day I proposed. I think this will help us keep that promise." She opened the envelope, and her eyes filled with tears as she read the document. "How did you manage this?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. "Dylan still thinks I had something to do with his face meeting a few fists," I said with a grin. I used that to our advantage. I thought it'd be fitting to make it official on our wedding day. Sophia and Olivia can legally take my last name. Grace had been right. When I made a promise, especially to a child, I did everything to keep it. Later that afternoon, Samantha and I met with Linda to finalize the adoption paperwork. It took only about 20 minutes for her to prepare the documents and get everything filed with the court. A week later, we received the incredible news that the adoption was set to be approved. The girls would officially become walkers. To share the news, we held a family meeting, where we announced that in 2 weeks, just 6 days before Christmas, Samantha and I would exchange vows, and the adoption would be finalized. Sophia and Olivia were beside themselves with excitement, and my parents couldn't wait to officially welcome their new granddaughters into the family. That evening, as we all relaxed by the fire, Sophia climbed onto my lap. She looked up at me with those big, earnest eyes and said, "Thank you, Dad." "For what?" I asked, feeling a lump in my throat. "For loving us enough to keep your promise," she whispered. I couldn't find the words to respond, so I just held her close, my heart full of gratitude for the family we were building together.